We've been told time and time again that capitalism supports democracy, but we spend most of the day in a place where we have no vote: our workplace. A democratic society needs to have democracy in the workplace. We are Democracy at Work, a worker-led, small donor-funded nonprofit making media that says we can do better than capitalism, an unjust economic system that is at odds with democracy. For us, critiquing the system isn't a taboo, it's a crucial step to a better world. Some of the most influential radical thinkers in America today host our free shows and author our books. With Democracy at Work, you can find different perspectives on class conflicts, the economy, and the impact of capitalism on our daily lives. Understand the root causes of the growing inequality all around us, and learn how democratic workplaces can shift power back into the hands of the majority in a real way. Our shows are free, with no ads, and our books are easy to understand. Our goal is to provide everyday people with simple explanations of ideas like Marxism and socialism, empowering you with the knowledge to create a more equitable future together. We seek a stronger, fuller democracy in and outside of the workplace. Watch, listen, or read Democracy at Work to learn how we can do better than capitalism. Hello, everyone. I am very excited to welcome you all to Stuck Nation Live with Bob Hennelly, a Democracy at Work event. What is Stuck Nation? It's one that willfully overlooks its blind spots and ignores its own hypocrisies. It's one that airbrushes its history and proselytizes a branding that is at odds with its history and ongoing reality. But we're going to break away from that today. There can be no forward motion if we fail to perceive just how deep of a rut we're in. So this afternoon, we are going to take some time to face our history and some of our nation's most exploitative systems and why they endure. But we're in good hands. While today's event will absolutely discuss some of the incredible events of the past year, we'll be basing it off of the major themes of the book, Stuck Nation: Can the United States change course on our history of choosing profits over people? Stuck Nation is the result of decades of exhaustive research and reporting by award-winning print and broadcast investigative journalist Bob Hennelly. We are thrilled to be joined by Bob today. Bob is currently the Labor Hall reporter for LaborPress, a New York City-based news source on regional and national labor issues. He hosts a morning drive time program on WBAI Pacifica in New York and 99.5 FM every Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, and he reports on labor issues on that program. He is also a regular contributor to Salon, Insider New Jersey, WBGO-Network Public Radio. I encourage you to read his full bio, which is on our website, and definitely follow him on Twitter at StuckNation. I also want to let our audience know today that the book Stuck Nation is on sale at a discounted price right now if you buy it on lulu.com. Avoid Amazon, avoid giving your money to Bezos. Lulu is where Democracy at Work and Bob will benefit from your purchase. There's a direct link in the video description below, and we'll place some in the comments for you as well. You can also find direct links on our website. So who am I? My name is Liz Phillips. I am Democracy at Work's co-managing and communications director. I'm going to be your host today, but I also want to acknowledge my colleagues that are behind the scenes helping me out today: Maria, Eric, and Maddie. Thank you for your help. We're going to start off today from hearing an update from Bob, whose reporting over the last year will bring many important, new, and relevant points to this discussion. Then in the second half of today's event, Bob will be taking questions from you all, our audience. So please write your questions in the chat or comment section from wherever you're watching today. It may not be possible to get to all the questions, but my colleagues and I will do our best as we select them. And to kick us off with that chat function, we'd love to hear where in our nation or our world you're tuning in from. So feel free to drop that in the chat or comments as well. Democracy at Work is based in New York City, and we'd like to acknowledge that the land politically designated as New York City to be the homeland of the Lenape, who were violently displaced as a result of European settler colonialism over the course of 400 years. And with that, I'm very excited to bring on our guest, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us. We're glad to have you here today.
It's really a pleasure. Thanks so much. Before I get started reflecting on our Stuck Nation Plus One, I want to thank you for all showing up today, and to those who will check this event out in its recorded format. I'd be remiss not to thank the great team of Democracy at Work for making this event possible. You know, as an author, you hope that when you write something like Stuck Nation, it'll stand the test of time. That's a tall order in an age where we have traumatic news like a global mass death event like COVID, the January 6th insurrection, and almost weekly mass shootings compressed into just 2 years. Oh, and did I include the existential conveyor belt of climate change we're on and the recent decision by the U.S. Supreme Court to eliminate almost overnight the reproductive rights of women that had been in place for half a century. Last July, with the publication of Stuck Nation, I asked, can the U.S. change the course of its history of choosing profits over people? In the years since, sad to say, the evidence doesn't look very good that in 2022 we're up for that. Meanwhile, the United States is more a stuck nation than ever, with our political leadership still debating who won the last election, which was concluded in 2020. Our Department of Justice, rather than concluding raids on U.S. oil multinationals and big pharma for price gouging, amidst an ongoing public health emergency, there'd be something to do, is hemming and hawing over whether they should indict a former president who planned and executed the first of its kind insurrection on the U.S. Capitol. They got to think about that. We're programmed from grade school to believe that American market capitalism is all about abundance. Yet whenever you really need to count on it, like amidst a life-threatening pandemic like COVID, all it has for the large majority of people, that's you and I, amidst a life-threatening pandemic like COVID, is scarcity. Scarcity of surgical masks, PPE, scarcity of diagnostic testing and vaccines, and even the sufficient time to get better and quarantine from a viral infectious disease. There's scarcity for that too. You saw that, where in the middle of it all, the CDC, once the airline said, hey, we are having trouble staffing planes, oh, okay, 10 days became 5. Nowhere was this more manifest in New Jersey, where I'm speaking to you from today, Neptune, New Jersey, as I like to shorthand it, Planet Neptune. For much of the COVID pandemic, New Jersey, a place where much of Big Pharma has been headquartered, aka the world's medicine chest, you must have heard of that, had the highest per capita COVID death rate, not just in the country, but in the world. We are the densest state by population, which poses a challenge when social distancing is required. But we're also very racially segregated, and wealth inequality is quite pronounced here. Depending on the zip codes, anywhere from 30% to over half of the households struggle week to week to get by, alongside some of the richest enclaves in the nation. It should tell you something. New Jersey was replaced by Alabama as having the highest COVID death rate per capita. That's right, a blue state replaced by a red state in a nation that's painted in the gray of perpetual scarcity. And while it appears that the January 6th insurrection was quelled at the U.S. Capitol, where the Congress was able to complete its ministerial duties, I would suggest that the Trump junta has successfully captured the U.S. Supreme Court. That's right, they were held off at the Capitol and walked down the street and are in control of the nation's highest court. Tragically, we need to see ourselves as not as the America of old that's in the hagiography that passes for our official history. Right now, we're more like an unstable country, half hung up in the cult of a strongman personality. And it's not really clear which way we're going to fall. Tragically, nationally, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of healthcare workers, first responders, and other essential workers put lost their lives as a consequence of the government's failed pandemic response, which included then President Trump pitting the red states off against the blue states by lying about the lethality and transmissibility of the virus that now has killed more than 1 million Americans, sickened tens of millions of others, and left an untold number permanently disabled. Count me as one of those outliers who believe that Donald Trump should be tried at The Hague for crimes against humanity. It should come as no surprise that there is no national registry of this catastrophic loss of essential workers and their families. And so it's like it didn't happen. And that's just how the captains of late-stage voter capitalism want it. While we as a nation are quick to make lists of our war dead and erect monuments in every town and square, we're not so much in a rush now to seemingly reluctantly memorialize the abject failure of our government during COVID. Our federal government that spent trillions on the military was so ill prepared for the pandemic that selfless individuals, I've written about these people, like CWA local administrative manager, she was with Local 180, Priscilla Caro, whose job it was to hand out masks in the early stages of COVID at Elmhurst Hospital. She had a job title that permitted that she couldn't wear a mask. Her job was to hand them out. She died from COVID before the vaccine was available. There's a street name for her. But there's so many more people like her whose stories haven't even been told. During this crisis, our elected leaders have paid lip service to addressing the vast racial disparities revealed in the disparate impact of COVID on poor communities of color. Last April, several months after Stuck-nation was published, Reverend Dr. William Barber and Columbia University economist Jeffrey Sachs released the first of its kind comprehensive study of COVID deaths in all of America's over 3,000 U.S. counties that plugged in the intersectionality of poverty, income, race, and geography. Quote, the findings we'll hear today, this is Dr. Barber, are shameful and will shock us because as a nation, we do not talk about poverty, Barber told the reporters at the press club when the analysis was released. Yet, he says, in the pandemic, we'll hear that there have been 2 to 3, 4, 5 times the death in poor communities and richer ones. We'll encourage everyone here to walk through the data after this conference and take the time to see what has been so far unseen. The findings are so contrary to a nation that claims first and foremost to establish justice, and certainly contrary to the call of God to care for the least of these, close quote. Barber continued, remember, this unnecessary death happened while we gave corporations $2 trillion to keep them alive, and the richest Americans saw their wealth soar. It's a gross example of what Naomi Klein has called the shock doctrine, when the wealthy exploit tragedy to increase their own profits while people suffer. This report shows that a poverty-producing and sustaining system was also a death-dealing system. Within this analysis, we can see that it did not need to be this way. If only we were honest about poverty and systemic racism and the systems of violence that allowed this tragedy, close quote. At the height of the pandemic, politicians also called out the perils of our healthcare system and our market economy. You remember this. They pointed out that it was a shame that it put such stock in real-time delivery and the preservation and accumulation of capital it promotes. Yet the same scarcity scenario continues to play out, most recently with infant formula, and now for monkeypox vaccine. How long will it take? How many couldn't see that coming fiascos have to happen before we own the reality that death and disease is the outcome when you have a healthcare system that runs on wealth accumulation and its preservation? That's its only job, folks. How long do we have to wait to come to that realization? Even when Washington passes a worthwhile program, there's a complete lack of follow-through. Take the expanded child tax credit that had the potential to lift 40% of the children in poverty out of poverty. It was passed as part of the American Rescue Plan, yet 5 million households have yet to collect $14 billion sitting in the U.S. Treasury. When you dig into the details, there are a myriad of reasons for this. Some are undocumented but have American children. Others have no access to Wi-Fi. Others have no bank. What better mission could there be for our elected officials and their staff than doing the work of helping these families one by one get this money and then making sure they're registered to vote? We're talking about potentially several $1,000s per family. In the midst of this inflation, you're talking about the difference between eviction, homelessness, and the security of shelter. Over the last few months, as record inflation has set in, our public discourse has been hijacked by the likes of former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers, who diagnoses our economic problems as stemming from our overspending on COVID relief. I'm sure you heard that, so meet the press. His prescription, of course, is austerity. That would be scarcity's kissing cousin. He along with their of America's Wealth Pyramid Scheme, believe that the purpose of the general population is to be used as a sacrifice to ensure that above all else, the value of money and the fortunes of those with the most of it remain intact. That's the job. As Andrew Perez and Nick Byron Campbell wrote in their recent Lever article, which I'll be sending out on social media, the Biden administration and Congress have actually set the stage for a recession because they have prematurely shut down the federal government pandemic aid by not following through with the downsized $1.8 trillion Build Back Better agenda. According to data from the U.S. Census Household Survey, the end of the pandemic relief coincided with almost a 50% spike in families struggling to get by. The pandemic was one of the worst economic shocks to the American economic system since the Great Depression, and in terms of the velocity of job loss, worse. While we were dealing with a once-in-a-century mass death event, a plague depression combo, think of it. It was unprecedented. How long was the FDR New Deal in operation? Let's see. From 1933 to 1939. While in 2022, our leaders got squeamish just after a couple of years, and nominal Democrats like Senator Joe Manchin got weak-kneed about raising taxes on the nation's wealthiest, who've seen an unprecedented windfall thanks to the pandemic. Consider that even your Wall Street economists point to a stressed labor market as part of the economy's headwinds. It's clear the lack of workers to fill the millions of open slots is wreaking havoc on everything from government permit approvals to the manufacturing of medical devices. We know that more than 2 million women were drafted out of the workforce to the home front when public education collapsed for the first time in modern history, and they had to school their children at home. It would seem if you wanted to benefit from the economic expansion of having them return to work, if they choose, you would pass universal child care in pre-K that paid people a living wage that provided it. There's stimulus, there's expansion, but it's at the bottom. Maybe that's the problem. If you want workers to return to work, why not flip the American tax pyramid, which for decades has punished workers by taxing their labor at a higher rate than idle capital? Now, it's true, campaign contributions come out of idle capital, labor, not so much. We've done it Larry Summers' way through Democratic and Republican administrations my whole lifetime. And the result has been the same. Ever higher military spending and ever widening income disparity with greater wealth accumulation, as well as corporate consolidation. I do see evidence of a change afoot for the better. I do. And this is what we live for, right? As a consequence of COVID and the loss of so many lives, Americans saw their government and the corporations fail to protect them from a killer virus. We were left to our own devices, and in the process, our value system was reordered with ourselves and families at the center of our lives, because it was all we really ever had. In speaking with the spouses who lost loved ones who worked in fields like public transit, and there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands, I have heard how it was extended families, neighborhoods, congregations that came through for these spouses and orphans left behind. The fundamental collective action outside of the government. That doesn't mean we let the government off the hook, but we have to have a government informed by our values. It's no accident that the last year, 47 million Americans left their job in search of a new arrangement, a new alignment. This is of anthropological significance. To get the sense of the scale of this, consider the entire AFL-CIO, with its 57 constituent unions, has 12.5 million members. Since I wrote Stuck Nation, Chris Smalls and the independent Amazon Labor Union has won the first successful unionization vote at that corporation's sprawling Staten Island facility. Close to 200 Starbucks have voted for a union. In the first half of this year, there's been a 57% increase over the same period in the last fiscal year in workplace petitions to organize. In the first half of this fiscal year, there were 1,174 such petitions compared to 748 over the same period the year before. Yes, these glimmers of hope are thanks in large measure to a younger generation who are embracing the reality that only through truly collective action can we turn the tide for our planet that's on a glide path to being unable to sustain life as we have known it. This awareness came rushing into me when I was down in Washington, D.C. on June 18th covering the Poor People's Campaign March, and I had this bittersweet flash that most of the thousands of people that were at the march were not alive when Dr. King walked on the earth and planned the first Poor People's Campaign march he would not live to see. Scientists tell us by the middle of this century, less than 30 years from now, we'll have lost summertime ice formations in the Arctic, unable to turn the tide on the ravages of global climate change. As the climate changes, the Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the planet. 3 years ago, Arctic air temperatures were about 3.4 degrees above average and were the second warmest since records began in 1900. The time is short and the stakes couldn't be higher. The torch has indeed been passed. Is this new infusion of energy in time enough? That's up to all of us to decide.
And it's such a big, big decision to make, isn't it? Though it's so easy to say one thing and then what do we do about it? Thank you so much for this update, Bob. There's so much that I didn't know, quite the stats about the number of people who were unable to access the stimulus. It's really shocking to know how that stimulus package that was supposed to go to so many families remained untouched for an extraordinary amount. Yeah.
And I will say that I did a survey of congressional websites, and to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's credit, you go to her website, and yeah, there's a political cheesy picture of her with somebody's baby that's not hers. Okay, that's the territory. You want to get reelected. But there's a guide there in Spanish and English where you can actually, a calculator, where you can put in what your income is and go through the process on that sheet, and it will tell you what you're entitled to and how to go about getting it. So that's the kind of granular community-based work. Nonprofits are doing it. United Way is doing it. But I think that if politicians really want to make change, they got to roll their sleeves up and get granular.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned access to internet as being one of those impediments too, right. Which is, I love sharing with people the history about how rural America was electrified. It was actually through a New Deal stimulus package that the big electric companies actually decided, no, this is not enough for us. We'll let that pass. Thanks very much. And it was people who actually lived in rural America who said, can we get together? Can we do this? And
right.
then, oh, okay, sure. So more than half of the landmass of the United States is electrified by cooperatives, actually.
Right.
And so now we're scratching our heads how to get people connected to the internet. And I just want to scream, do like we did before. Come on.
Well, in that duration of help, I mean, the Tennessee Valley Authority is a place you can drive and see. It still exists. And that aid, that direct aid to American households and to local economies continued. I mean, one of the things we're seeing as a beat reporter at City Hall in New York City is that New York City is already having to make bad choices. They had to cut $200 million from education. They had to lay off for at least a day 200 parks workers whose job it is to go and clean up the restrooms and to make sure glasses in the playground. They got rehired after we did a local councilman got involved. But we're starting to see already that this isn't sufficient aid. They're more concerned at this point about preservation of capital than getting the country back on track.
Right, exactly. Well, okay, so this is a good thing to kick us off. We've got a couple questions in the chat, and I've got a couple ones to throw at you too if I get my space. But before we start with those questions, I just like to quickly remind our audience that this event is produced by Democracy at Work. We are a nonprofit that makes media that says we can do better than capitalism, and we're supported by donations. And so we'd like to thank all of our generous supporters who make our work possible, especially our monthly donors who allow us to plan into the future. We're really, really grateful to have such an active, engaged audience with us. And if you'd like to join in sharing our work or learning about the ways you can donate, whatever you want to do to support us, we thank you for that. And you can go to our website to learn about all the different ways you can support our work. We plan on hosting more live virtual events like this one in the future. So if you want to get updated about those while you're at our website, sign up to our email mailing list so that you can get first notification about that. Let's get started with some questions now. And whether or not your questions are answered in this event today, I want to thank you for engaging with us in the comments and remind you that Bob is very active on Twitter. So be sure to follow him there at stuck-nation. And you'll continue to learn from his fascinating reporting every day. So with that, I am going to, we had a couple people tuning in from different from a few different places. So I just kind of want to give a shout out to the people who are tuning in from, let's say, Montreal. Hello, Robert. We've got someone from the budding metropolis of Owen Sound, Ontario. Thank you for joining us from up over there. We've got someone up in Portland, Oregon. Hi, Christopher. Got a couple other people. So thanks so much for throwing in where you're coming from. It's cool to see the audience and where they're all tuning in from. So I'm gonna start with this might be like the good end note, but I just want to start bigger. I want to show a comment from Bob Dickinson. He wants to hear your view on the values, the truly human values that you believe are worth our focus now.
Well, as I said, I think that this near-death event or death event for so many households has, as an anthropological matter, a psychosocial matter, has forced us to reevaluate. And one of the things I did working this during the period of time for the chief leader of another newspaper, I was calling and speaking with every day New York City FDNY EMTs, firefighters, the civil service, also through my contacts at the American Federation of Government Employees, speaking to people who were going into the meat processing facilities and dealing with, hearing from them the tribulations they were going through and the challenge they were facing, because many of the employers were resistant to giving them the information they needed. And in those cases, the degree to which you had a good union was the degree to which that you had some protection, somebody looking out for you. So one of the things that's been revealed is the power of collective action. And indeed, the people that were represented, and I think there's going to be some good research coming out. There's already been some preliminary white papers on this that show that if you were represented, your odds of getting PPE, your odds of getting through the crisis were better. And so it's this notion that when we break out of our silos, which is what this marketed capitalism system does, it promotes competition, keeping up with the Joneses. Once you come to recognize the commonality of human experience, then that fear and anxiety becomes the base for organizing. I say this as someone who's been involved in the foreclosure resistance movement. Myself, my family was caught up in a nasty battle with Wells Fargo. There was a certain point at which that we couldn't afford to pay the mortgage. The value of the home dropped dramatically. They weren't willing to renegotiate the principal, and they actually did some things that were not above board. So we fought them, and that took a toll. But the reality is that once I came clean with the people in my community and neighborhood, usually it's a thing of shame if you can't pay your bills, right? But once you share with people your tribulation, honestly, and what you're up against, and at that case, we're in the process of trying to help our kids that were coming out of college into a recession. They needed help, and we were fighting the bank. And that went on. And so that meant we had to share our vulnerability with our neighbors. But out of it came a kind of power. And I had a lot of real conversations with people who were able to share their circumstance. And so out of that, instead of being individuated with shame, I felt empowered.
Oh, that's such a good point. I mean, think about, I used to work as an editor for advertising, and I used to put together commercials on how you could go to debt for a lazy boy suite, and it wasn't great, but and it drove me nuts, but obviously, people go into debt for these feelings of show, or the need to showcase success and being okay. It's the opposite. Like, that's the refusal to say, no, I'm actually not in a great space right now. I'm not making, and my ends aren't being, I'm not making ends meet,
Right.
So it's so much debt is bloated even just from that,
Right. And then also one of the things that came out of this period of time of 4 years of living in resistance in a suburban cul-de-sac, kind of rural place. And my daughter started her organic farm, a community sustainable agricultural model, brought together the community in a way I could never anticipate, transcended political subdivisions, because the area, that part of Morris County, had an agricultural past. And no matter what political party you were, if you had grandkids, you were coming by to feed our goats. And so there was a common denominator there and a sense of collective power that existed in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very powerful, very powerful. Thanks for sharing that. Um, Here we've got a couple other people coming in from even farther reaches of the world. We have blessings on high from the Odawa Nation on Mackinac Island,
Praise be.
and there was also I'm trying to find.
Yeah, I had a period of time where I was in Traverse County, Leelanau County. I had an idea of farming that didn't go so well, but I was young. Yeah, I had some ideas. I tried to prove them out in the world. I had a very sore back. Yeah. 3 years, not the, I thought I could buy a house for $34,000 that had a barn and 20 acres. I thought, oh, this is going to be great. You have to bring all the money you'd ever need to survive. And yeah, it was a very interesting place. And it was something where it was very agricultural. And what was happening there was that cherry farmers whose kids didn't want to take over the farm were finding themselves under pressure from resort developers who wanted to go in and buy up their land. And once one resort would come in and buy, the people that wanted to farm were in a position where they could be pushed out. And so that's another thing too. I did some organizing there, and it was kind of like I was, in my early 30s from New Jersey, and they're like, well, if you're young, why are you here? Like, our kids have left. Like, you're not well.
Well, we're gonna try something, shouldn't we?
Yeah, right.
All right. Well, it's not a question, but it's a comment, and it's one from someone in the audience. And here I'm going to show it up. We can talk about this in different ways, but the greatest threat to peace and democracy anywhere on this planet is the government of the United States of America. Obviously, this, we can talk about a specific government, the function of government as well. You touched a little bit on that, so maybe if you want to take this comment and
I made a point of making sure that the military-industrial complex was woven throughout Stuck Nation. You may remember in our conversations formulating the book, that was something I wanted to feature high. I believe that there's no doubt that the military-industrial complex is a threat to the planet. It's a threat to tranquility. It is. I do find it a kind of this odd thing where we ruminate over the fact that AR-15s are proliferating and we can't make our grade school safe, and we've been exporting billions of dollars of weapons around the world, and that who knows how many important places of public assembly the U.S. munitions have blown up. I mean, I would tell you that the whole post 9/11 period, where we created a further notice war on terrorism, actually proliferated terrorism, destabilized the nation states, creating one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War, all brought on by the serial wars that we pursued without accountability. I think the nadir of it was when at some point in Niger we lost track of some American veterans, fighters who died in country. And none of the senators and the Armed Services Committee knew we had soldiers there. So the dereliction of duty just didn't start with Donald Trump. It's been on autopilot for a long time. And I do believe that we will not be able to turn around our circumstance without addressing the military-industrial complex in a fundamental way.
Right. So important. I mean, we spend so much more than any other nation. We find, there's nothing left to public schools.
And borrowed money. I mean, that what kills me is that when it comes to full-time universal child care, everybody gets very nervous about fiscal austerity. Lawrence Summers and Steve Ratner, oh, this is bad. Oh, public spending. Whoa. And they don't even hesitate to take borrowed money to buy weapon systems. And one of the things too about this pernicious thing of borrowing, I talked about it once on Economic Update with Rick Wolf, is that who is buying this debt? One of the things, it's an engine for wealth inequality. So after you've managed to get your ill-gotten gains from exploiting labor and ruining the environment around the world, you get it stashed in the Cayman Islands, you'd like to bring it back, but you don't want to pay taxes. Well, you buy government bonds. And so that's another way that the public finance of the United States leverages and accelerates wealth inequality.
Right. Absolutely. Well, I mean, and speaking of the militarization of, or also comes into our own streets with just the proliferation of guns everywhere in the hands of
Right.
people who aren't even military. And as Richard Wolff was reporting on an economic update recently,
Right.
there's now even the counter, or the business that supports it in a different way, offering protection services for people, for businesses, for in universities, something we do. Whatever we do to screen to make sure that guns don't come on your campus. But even they then
Right.
themselves, their business model relies on there being too many guns on our streets in the first place.
Of course, this is another example of the excesses of how capital then goes in and corrupts the system. So we do have, it's not like the idea of having a assault weapons ban is abstract. It existed in the United States. And you can go back to a point in time in the 90s up until the beginning of 2000s where there was a dramatic drop in assault weapon mass shootings. And one of the things that Congress did at the behest of the weapons manufacturers is to give them an indemnification from being sued. I mean, it's not like, that's why when they say fair, it's all about the open, free, and fair market. It is not. It is about very much a tilted playing field. And that's because of the campaign finance connection to capital.
I want to show a comment that came in a little earlier when we were talking about housing. Saying sent letters to all defaulted borrowers only to say credit is always refinance. Walking away from the home was the best decision. Completely wiped out our debt.
Well, and that it depends how you're situated, because if you're in a situation where you need the shelter and you do believe that you have a fight worth fighting, and we did. Some people won in this fight. We supported people there were some people that, because let's remember, we did have robo-signing as a huge mass crime that was documented that occurred. That's one of the things that happened with Wall Street. They went and doctored en masse the foreclosure papers and the underlying paperwork for thousands and thousands of homes. They had to pay out and had to come up with all kinds of money to pay their way out of trouble, but they weren't criminally prosecuted. And some of those practices continue to this day. I mean, I felt that in our case, it was worth fighting for. It was worth standing up in court and trying to hold them accountable and using the levers of power. It is true as a personal economic note, if you're in that situation and you don't have the gumption to fight, it's probably the best thing to walk away.
Right. I just lost it. Oh, I had a comment to share. Oh, yes, here we go. From Kevin. As Kevin says, capitalism guarantees wealth inequality and militarization. The system is set up for exactly these purposes.
Yeah, that's it. And I do think that there is the ability for collective individuals working together to create a living. I've seen that. I do see that there's models where you can be active in the economy, but that doesn't mean that your decisions have to be driven entirely by the profit motive without any regard for how you're making the money.
Right. All right, well, here, let's bring in another comment or a question from Robert Cox. This is one from YouTube. The USA is one of the three large nations, USA, China, and Russia, that are competing, but how could they be cooperating instead?
Yeah, well, that is kind of what we are hoping for with climate change in Paris, right, in the abstract. I do think that part of the problem is that we have the people that have a hold of this conversation have everything betting on this competitive model. And so the way it works is, for the purpose of capital formation, nations don't matter. But for the purpose of manipulating the system, they use national identity as a way to marginalize the interests that they're trying to subdue. And so I do think that that is the model we have. We are not going to attain any kind of planetary equilibrium ecologically without some form of cooperation. And so I guess we have to that's why I have been so impressed by the direct diplomacy that you see like Medea Benjamin do in Project Pink, going to areas of conflict, peeking behind the curtain, and then engaging people in Cuba, people in Palestine directly. That kind of short circuits this conversation that's controlled by the forces of polarity that benefit by this kabuki of competition.
Well, I want to keep on this trend. This is a comment from someone actually on Twitter that we're able to bring in. Eric on Twitter says, socialism is trending on Twitter right now. How do we use this moment to get unstuck from American capitalism and get people on Twitter on the streets?
Well, I think it's to reflect back on the things that have advanced America historically, which have been collective action. One of the problems is our history is framed around great white men. And so the idea is that individuals, and that's what you're brought up with in a conventional upbringing in school, that individuals make a difference. So we don't really have a really good labor history piece. That's one of the important things that I do that Stuck Nation tells. Hey, I plugged the book. We're all 45 minutes in and I'm plugging the book. But one of the things in the book is it tracks what I'm familiar with, which is Lower Manhattan and the history of how female garment workers, primarily undocumented or certainly new arrivals, primarily women in their early 20s, had a general strike in 1909 and were really redefining the nature of the garment industry in Lower Manhattan. It was out of that the Triangle Fire happened because the owners were the most resistant to unionization, and they had locked the doors and made it so that they controlled people coming in and out because they were trying to throttle this organizing effort that was really winning. I mean, imagine that 20,000 undocumented immigrants today in any city coming together and organizing collectively. And what was amazing was that they were supported by the wealthy women of the period from society who were themselves pushing for the vote. So there was a synergy between class and immigration and that came together in a potent way. And when that fire happened and some dozens, over 120 young women died, it galvanized what turned into a global movement for the labor movement. And that success has been replicated around the world. Now, what happened was in the 1980s with Ronald Reagan, when he fired all the air traffic controllers, and years of capital beating up on the labor movement, and the labor movement itself getting co-opted through organized crime, self-dealing, some of which goes on today, we've got to be honest. What ended up happening was labor was short-circuited. And so what we had, and this is covered frequently in Economic Update, the 1970s saw this weird thing happen where productivity continued to take off and wages declined or stayed flat for people. That trend has pretty much continued. And so what's happening is people are working longer and having less to show for it. And what happened was, capital's not stupid. Instead of actual disposable income, they gave you household debt. So you felt like you were taking that trip to Disney, but you paid for it for 5 years. And so this is the part of the contract, the social contract of work is being upended as we speak. We are seeing a generation that wants work on their terms, and it doesn't show any signs of letting up.
Yeah, I mean, we've even seen this with the Great Resignation and people demanding better conditions in the workplace, especially, even if it's a remote, in-person hybrid, even that is now like a demand, and it's becoming if this doesn't work, I will walk away, Chip.
Right. I'll do something else.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, let's talk more about the book from that point. In chapter 8, you emphasize the need for new militancy in organized labor. Tell us what that is. What is the new militancy? What does that look like to you?
Well, I mean, it's maybe I can give you an example by telling you none of these things are going to happen on a dime. So for years and years, the labor unions, when it came to reproductive rights, as long as Roe v. Wade was the law of the land and reproductive rights were guaranteed, there was some variation from state to state, but basically they really didn't have to take a stand necessarily. I mean, you had some healthcare unions that did because it was in their field, they understood the importance of it. And so historically, the AFL-CIO, particularly at the state level, stayed on the sidelines because the church, the Catholic Church, had always been somewhat of an ally on issues like labor rights, immigrant rights. And so there was a kind of bargain there. That's not working, and we're seeing that the more, I would say, dynamic labor unions understand the linkage that there's an indivisibility between reproductive rights and labor rights. And so we're seeing labor stepping up in a big way as part of this overarching battle. There's some folks that are still from the old school who are like, I did a story where the New Jersey AFL-CIO is endorsing an incumbent Republican, Chris Smith, who's been in Congress for a long time. He's very anti-abortion, but he's been an incumbent who's voted for labor. So what's happening is you have elements within labor now pushing the question there with leadership saying, wait a minute, just because somebody's an incumbent doesn't mean we can't go for the change agent when the stakes are so high. Similarly, we're seeing in the case of what's happening, there's a number of instances, particularly in the nonprofit sector, where people are organizing in unions and actually willing to strike. We're seeing that people are stepping up. That kind of thing is far more common. Also, we're seeing people show up at shareholder meetings or stockholder meetings and actually making a fuss and introducing resolutions to try to oppose some of the most anti-worker policies. So it's opening up on all fronts right now. And the most important thing that we have right now is a National Labor Relations Board that for the first time in a long time actually is living up to what it's supposed to do, which is promoting organized labor, which is what it was started for. For years, it was in the clutches of corporations and management side law firms.
It's good to hear from someone who's been following this so closely, to hear that over here, there's good things happening over here. It's nice. Change of pace. So here's a comment from James on YouTube. He's trying to organize people locally around the idea of creating a worker-owned cooperative incubator for businesses. And he wants to know if you would have any advice or organizations to suggest in connecting with. I'm not sure exactly where James is, but if you know anybody that's specific to your area, Bob, or beyond, any of that would be helpful.
Well, I have a great model, which is the cooperative, which is nearby. And is just an amazing enterprise. And it's so funny because I was, as a humble author, first-time author, wrote many news articles, but wrote my first book for Democracy at Work. You're walking around and going cold into a place like a Britannicus encyclopedia salesman. Do you want to buy a book? Really? And so fortunately, they saw Rick Wolf's quote on the front, and my work was done. Like, oh, we know Democracy at Work. Now, I'm sure that's not representative of but this is an amazing enterprise located in Asbury Park, which is a happening place in New Jersey. And it started a relatively small, as a collective of people of interest, and then it's grown. So the key thing is finding where people are doing something similar nearby. And so you may have to go a distance, but, and then also I would say that there's alternative things going on all over the place. There's all kinds of, and the internet requires, some social media. The other thing to do is I also would encourage direct conversation with folks. They can, through my Twitter, I do interact directly. So I could probably do a better job helping you out if you get in contact with me. I particularly get a lot of stories for Salon out of people contacting me through social media or that have observations or things they're involved with firsthand. Similarly, with any kinds of organizing ideas, do have.
Sure. We got a request, Bob, if you could please repeat the name of the Bookstore Cooperative.
Oh, the Asbury Book Cooperative, ABC.
That's clever.
Tell them I sent you. They might have a copy of this.
Well, and also to other folks wanting to know about what, what cooperatives are out there in the world, the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives is a great source. It's maybe, in the U.S. is probably the best known. It brings together in one big list all the cooperatives that it can to say these are all the co-ops here all around the world. So going there and searching through the directory to find cooperatives near you is good. Is a good start to talk to them. But of course, they have plenty of other resources there as well.
I would also, can I do a commercial for credit unions?
Sure.
I mean, one of the things that is very important is that credit unions we were talking about values before, and I've spent a lot of time covering out a stint at CBS Money Watch, which is very straight, movement of money and Wall Street oriented, but it was a great education because my job was to study what was happening in capital markets and commodity markets overnight, and then write about what was going to happen the next day. And one of the things that I've had a real appreciation for, I'm a member of a credit union. And credit unions are nonprofit cooperative organizations where they're democratically run. You can be on the board, you can be involved with the decision making, and the profits that are generated actually go towards keeping the cost down of banking, and also of making sure that that money stays locally and is invested in small businesses and in communities' mortgages. That's not like I'll give you an example. The Municipal Credit Union in New York, which just was founded in 1916, has $5 billion under management, 500,000 members, went through a little spate of trouble, but recently it's back up and, being run locally. It had been taken over by the National Credit Union Administration. But one of the things that's fascinating is it's a place where if you're starting out as a firefighter or a police officer, and you're not from money, there's a certain amount of money you have to spend to get your equipment, right? It's one of the few places you can go and just show that you have a promise of employment, and they will give you the money in advance to buy the equipment you need to be able to do your civil service job. So that's the kind of thing, and I think that's the kind of thing when we talk about restructuring society. I'm also a big proponent of postal banking, because one of the things I found out researching, my brother Christopher is involved with doing nonprofit accounting work, community-based work, as a storefront, helps folks out. And one of the things that he finds is that the impediment to getting that money we talked about, that billions of dollars, is something as simple as people don't have online banking. And so one of the key things you can do there is once you plug people into some kind of financial situation where they can manage their affairs and in a cooperative fashion, you begin to help them actualize. And so that there is a model. Like, we don't have to be alienated from money, but it's the capitalist value system of individuation, not acting in collective community concern, that we have to avoid.
Yeah, all great points. Thank you for sharing all this information about the credit unions too. It's really important to think about how to better or place, put our money. I remember
Right.
I was very proud and loud when I withdrew all my money from Wells Fargo. I was very loudly, and they're like, "Why do you close your account?" And I was like, "Well,
you have an hour."
Yeah, exactly. Let me speak in a louder tone of voice, but the post office being used for banking is one of those ideas that just excites me. Italy has a post office that does so much more than send and ship packages. And you can not only hold your bank account, you can pay your bills through them. You can even, get loans, etc., through them. And it's a thriving organization. I mean,
well, we had a postal bank. The thing that's crazy is that, like the assault weapon ban, it existed. It was happening. It was also a place where people, it was all over the place. So there's easy access. It was a lot of immigrants used it. And it's also something where when you look at the conventional commercial banking, we have like banking deserts, supermarket deserts. I mean, this is the model of capitalism. So reconstruction is going to be by plugging into abundance, and collectives are about abundance. Capitalism is about scarcity.
well, scarcity for most and abundance for others. I'm going to turn this banking question a little bit. I mean, we're on such a nice positive note, which would be great to end, but we are talking about stuck nation.
Right,
We are still stuck. We should remember
right,
also what we're up
right,
against.
right.
I have a comment here from James from YouTube. Can Bob speak to BlackRock and Vanguard, their influence, and what we can do to contest the
Oh,
1%?
so it's funny because these BlackRock is at the top of my mind because I was covering this horrendous battle in Alabama related to a coal miner strike that's gone on forever. It was a case where it was a bankrupt coal mine. The workers, in good faith, took major concessions in wages and to help them get back on their feet. They did. And then the company has been reneging on its part of the deal, and BlackRock holds a big piece of that. So this is what I was saying before, that these funds now have to be held accountable. I know that there are some old school folks who say the only way to do this is for transformation is to strike, and that's certainly an important tool in the tool chest and organize. But there is this sense that, particularly with Congress stuck like it is and incapable of doing anything for working people, really, is that I'll give you an example. We had Brad Lander, the controller of New York City, elected office, and Tom DiNapoli, the New York State controller. Between them, they managed a couple hundred billions of dollars of public pension money. They enlisted a group of other like-minded pension managers of public pensions. Between New York State and New York City alone, they had $5 billion of Amazon stock. And so when Amazon had its annual shareholder meeting and they were going to just rubber stamp the board directors, who, by the way, said it was okay for the top 5 executives to realize $400 million in compensation, they actually got a shareholder resolution, and 27% of the outside stock voted against these people being reappointed. That is a toehold in the door. I have seen other situations where diversity is now being challenged, and sometimes what's happening is the board of directors is agreeing to the concession or compromising because they don't want the fight. But we have to fight in all fronts now. So it includes, like, I'm working on something about Chipotle. That's another place that's been abusing its workforce. It's a place that's made all kinds of money. It's a place that's very reliant on its brand and on customer loyalty. So one of the things that the organizers are doing, 32BJ, which I think is creative, is having consumers who are part of the loyalty. You know how all those places like to incentivize you to be one of their consumers, using that platform as a way for consumers to tell Chipotle it matters how their workers are treated. So we have to work on all fronts. The other thing I like to do, whenever I go and get some kind of service somewhere, I get some help loading something up. We do a lot of projects around here, garden tree. I always give some money to the people helping me. I mean, I'm Social Security, and I always have this conversation where I say to the kid, usually a kid, here's some money. I hope you guys get a union. It was good to me. And I do that all the time because those conversations build intergenerational trust, and you'd be surprised how much you learn from it. And for a couple of bucks, you get a great conversation.
This is amazing. I love learning how you do your. We hear the phrase "on the ground reporting." What does that look like? And so this is exactly it. I mean, this is all the ways that Bob starts a conversation with people.
Yeah, one time I had a conversation that I was at Lowe's, and we're very enthusiastic gardeners here, and so we were picking out plants, and we had a great conversation. And the woman said, "Listen, if you're a reporter, I want to show you what this corporation does." And she took me backstage to show me how they dump all these plants, living plants, vegetable plants. That was a fun social media experience. I mean, people need to know that we have their back, that their experience matters. Mm-hmm. And the way to do that is by having conversations.
Absolutely. I'm glad you're out there. I mean, I want to wrap this up. I'm going to take the spot of the last question as we close this out. So in the book and in much of your work, you call upon the need for workers to stand up to the undermining of worker solidarity. I mean, even
Right.
just in this last story you showed us about how you'd speak to these people who deliver them, give a couple bucks,
Right, right.
that's all part of it. But I want you to tell us, what is this undermining that divides workers, and what are the ways in which workers can overcome it?
Well, so I think that, and Chris Smalls, who has been doing so much, he's been on my program like a number of months before he was successful. I do think in the telling of the Amazon story, because they were successful in the large facility, they got 2,700 votes, yes, maybe 2,200 votes, no. But in a smaller facility of part-time workers, they were not successful. And in talking with people about it, one of the things is that the part-time workforce was in a situation where they were hopeful they might be full-time, or they didn't have the commitment that to the job that they thought it was worth taking the stress of standing up to management. So one of the things that happens is the idea that your circumstance is connected to the fate of the people around you. And so there's one of the things that happens in workplaces is sometimes there's a model where they try to pit people against each other. And that's the way the organization makes their numbers, right? And so it's very important that when you're in those situations, that you bring a little consciousness to it and you step back, particularly if you're finding yourself stressed, because there's a reason why you're feeling stressed. And so how do you change that dynamic around? Well, you have to evaluate and look at the system that you're in. And we have to make a living. I mean, you just can't, I mean, you can hold out for the perfect job, but, and like I say, be willing to take a risk to get past your comfort zone, to talk to the people around you. That kind of communication changes the workplace automatically. And it's not something that management likes. I mean, that's one of the things Amazon, the way they've structured it, for instance, they make people, they put so much pressure on them, they have to be on task. But that's where it's at. Like, make an investment. You spend a lot of time of your life at work, and so don't leave your values at home. Bring them to work.
That's a great ending line. I mean, you also had said earlier, I wrote it down instantly to highlight it. Your circumstances connected to the people around you. I mean, we forget that. We think that so much of like our, what happens to us is a result of our individual effort or our this, but it's
Right.
actually very much, we're very interconnected, and you do right to remind us about that, and how we continue to talk to each other will only reinforce that. Well, we're at time, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today. These aren't easy conversations to have, especially when we see and feel the daily impacts of an oppressive and exploitive system that we live in. But it's critical to recognize and talk about them in order to change historical patterns and get ourselves out of this stuckness. So thank you all for being a part of that with us today. And a huge thank you to Bob for your time today and for all your ongoing important work. Thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you. At Stuck Nation, let's keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. You can definitely follow Bob at Stuck Nation, all one word, lowercase. You'll have a much livelier Twitter thread after you follow him. And if you want to know more about events like these, again, be sure to go to our website, democracyatwork.info. Be sure to sign up for the email newsletter. Producing events like these, along with all of our other shows or podcasts and books, it's always been dependent on audience donations. So consider please donating to Democracy at Work with a monthly or one-time gift. Monthly supporters are really invaluable in that they allow us to plan for the future. And if you do anything before the end of July, you should pick up your copy of Stuck Nation, which is discounted right now through the end of July. So go and grab that off of lulu.com, where you will support us and not Bezos and not Amazon. And it'll be discounted too. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Bob. And everybody, have a great rest of your day.